On the morning of September 1st, 1939, the world was suddenly ripped apart at the seams. With little warning and no provocation, the German military launched a full-scale invasion of Poland, unleashing a new tactic known as blitzkrieg or lightning war. The Nazi forces hit the unsuspecting Polish defenders like a freight train. Dive bombers screamed, tanks unleashed furious salvos, and highly mobile infantry troops swarmed across the border on motorcycles. Within days, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany, finally accepting the size of Adolf Hitler's ambitions. The people of Poland defended their homes for over a month, but eventually the Polish army was beaten into submission. The winter of 1939 and 1940 saw a lull in the fighting, but when spring arrived, the Germans unleashed another offensive, this time against the Low Countries and France. Outmaneuvered and still weary from the First World War, the French found themselves between a hammer and an anvil. Forcing their way through a gap in the Allied defenses, German armored divisions plowed into the French countryside. By June of 1940, they were at the outskirts of Paris. Though some French soldiers managed to escape with their British allies during the evacuation of Dunkirk, the majority of them were forced to surrender. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen to the German troops. For the next 4 years, the people of France lived under the boot of Nazi oppression. Though Nazi forces were slowly pushed back by Russian armies in the east and cornered by British and American troops in Africa and southern Europe, France remained fully under German occupation until June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allied troops that landed on the beaches of Normandy and later in southern France began the violent struggle that was the liberation of France. Social memory remembers the American troops who made up the bulk of this counter-invasion as heroes. History, on the other hand, paints a different picture. In this video, we will examine the crimes committed by American GIs against the French population during World War II, and the response of the US military command to these crimes. This video is not intended to dismiss the valor shown by the Allied soldiers that fought to liberate France, but rather to serve as a reminder that in war, no side is free of crimes and abuses. Technically, the process of liberating France started almost as soon as the country fell to the German armies. After he managed to escape the country, a low-level general named Charles de Gaulle formed the French government in exile. As the leader of the new Free France, de Gaulle sent out a call for all French forces scattered around the globe to join in the effort to retake their homeland. At first, only a handful of units answered him, but as the Allies pushed into North Africa, more and more French troops organized under the banner of Free France. The men serving in France's imperial colonies were especially receptive. By the time the war ended, roughly 2/3 of the men serving under de Gaulle came from colonial territories. While the French forces scattered around the globe slowly organized into an effective fighting force, the people of France also answered de Gaulle's call to arms. The French resistance was born in the same moment that the country fell. Starting as scattered cells committing small acts of rebellion, the resistance was composed of various people from all parts of life. Old, young, men, women, and even teenagers embraced the cause of liberation in one way or another. Early in the war, the most common form of resistance was helping Allied pilots who had been shot down over France during air raids. More than 5,000 airmen were rescued by the members of the French resistance, shuttled through safe houses and secret escape routes back to England. As the tides of war turned against Germany and its allies, the various groups forming the resistance became more and more organized, and more violent. The final development of the French resistance came once the Allied armies invaded France in 1944. Shortly before the invasion occurred, General de Gaulle embraced the scattered resistance fighters as part of the Free French Forces. Christening them as the French Forces of the Interior, de Gaulle sponsored efforts to better equip and organize the various cells. After the Normandy invasions, the FFI were directly incorporated into the French army. The Allied High Command placed 200,000 resistance fighters directly under the command of General Marie-Pierre Koenig, who utilized them alongside other Free French forces in the liberation of France. The service of the FFI before and after the Allied landings was recognized by the American and British forces they served beside. General Alexander Patch believed that the military assistance provided by the French resistance was the equivalent of having 4 full Allied divisions in France. The Free French forces and the French forces of the interior undoubtedly played a large role in liberating France. But the main blow against German forces came from the Allied invasions. Though Italy was attacked by Allied armies as early as 1943, the vast majority of Western Europe had been under the boot of German armies since 1940. To begin the process of rolling back the Nazi tide in Western Europe, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower coordinated a massive invasion of the northern coast of France. A combined American, British, and Canadian force of over 150,000 men landed on 5 beaches across the Normandy coast simultaneously. June 6, 1944 saw the beginning of the direct liberation of France itself, with Allied men and materials streaming into the country from the landing points taken across Normandy. Brutal fighting occurred as the American, British, and French forces tried to force their way deeper into France. The fierce German defense forced the Allies into a massive battle of attrition, with cities being taken block by block, building by building, and room by room. The massive number of casualties taken by German forces, combined with an invasion of southern France by the Allies in August, finally turned the tide in favor of the Allies. Encouraged by the approach of American forces, the FFI forces in Paris launched an armed uprising against the German soldiers occupying the city. Gunfire consumed the City of Love for an entire week, with the French partisans slowly forcing the German units into smaller and smaller defensive positions. Finally, the Free French forces and a small contingent of American and British soldiers arrived in the city. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and opposed by the population of the city itself, the German garrison surrendered on 25th of August 1944. By the winter of 1944, nearly all of France had been liberated from the Nazis. A handful of German garrisons in port cities held their ground until Germany surrendered in May of 1945. But the majority of French citizens spent 1945 living under the largely benevolent presence of British and American troops. The majority of the troops that remained in France after the war were American, and the cultural memory of these men, especially in the United States, is that they fraternized with the French people, spent their wages in French stores, and courted French girls. The reality, however, is that the American occupation of France was not a completely harmless or beneficiary experience for the French population. Though the American soldiers were not nearly as cruel as their German predecessors, they were still men far from home who had just experienced months of intense combat. As the people of France would discover, these men were not above taking advantage of or even abusing the people they claimed they had liberated. People who have been through traumatic experiences often need an outlet to vent their stress. Soldiers are no different, and the American troops who fought their way through France experienced more than their fair share of violence and heartbreak. As the war concluded, millions of men found themselves in France with no enemy to fight, nowhere to go, and nearly a year of violence and killing imprinted in their psyches. This, combined with the massive egos fueled by the recent victory over the Nazi military machine, created a perfect storm of explosive human behavior. Between the participation of Free French forces in the liberation of France and the newly reinstated status of France as an independent nation, the French people expected the Americans to behave as benevolent saviors. Assuming they would generally be treated with respect and kindness by the GIs, the French were shocked to discover that the American soldiers instead viewed themselves as the de facto rulers of France. As the weeks after the war turned into months, The bored and increasingly dissatisfied soldiers became more and more violent against the people they had been deployed to protect. Theft, motor vehicle accidents, and destruction of property occurred across France, with one citizen remarking, "We expected friends who would not make us ashamed of our defeat." Instead, there came incomprehension, arrogance, incredibly bad manners, and the swagger of conquerors. People were run over by drunken soldiers driving through towns. Bars were destroyed by American GIs when they ran out of liquor or when they attempted to stall the often excessive drinking of the soldiers. Men who were once viewed as heroes became bullies, and the general opinion of the French people towards American soldiers went from grateful to wary. It is important to note that not all soldiers behaved this way. In fact, most of them did not. However, a large enough proportion of the soldiers destroyed property that the public opinion of the French regarding American soldiers during World War II remains very different from the American view to this day. If the crimes committed by American soldiers had only been property-related, time would have probably healed the wounds of the French. However, theft and vandalism were the lesser of the crimes committed by the GIs who occupied France. Recent research has uncovered that American troops assaulted and raped hundreds, if not thousands, of French women in the months immediately following World War II. Though this is damning enough, an even more twisted detail has been uncovered by historian Mary Lou Roberts. The US military exploited prevailing views of the sexual openness of French women to encourage men to enlist. Armed with the militarily promoted belief that eager and experienced French women were waiting to reward their heroic saviors, American troops arrived in France ready to soothe their carnal urges in any way possible. In fact, Life magazine had once described France as a tremendous brothel inhabited by 40 million hedonists, a telling indication of American views towards France during the war. The sexual fervor of the liberators was seen almost as soon as they established a foothold in France. Shortly after the liberation of Paris, the American military command in France was beset with accusations of assault and rape of French women. In response, General Charles Gerhardt established the Blue and Grey Corral outside of the city of Renan. A militarily sponsored brothel, it was shut down after a paltry 5 hours to prevent the press from discovering that the United States military had willingly created a house of ill repute. Though the military refused to sponsor a full-fledged brothel, it had far fewer reservations about soldiers using prostitutes. As the American occupation of France marched on after the German surrender, the soldiers pursuing French prostitutes became more and more brazen. Americans having sex with French prostitutes in public areas, in broad daylight no less, was not an uncommon sight, and the sexual appetite of the liberators quickly became a social and physical burden on the French people. Appeals were made by local officials to the American military, asking for the establishment of large brothels, but their requests fell on deaf ears. By refusing to publicly endorse prostitution, the American military forced the problem of their soldiers' carnal escapades entirely on the French public. Prostitution is certainly unsavory, but it is, loosely speaking, consensual. However, there were millions of American soldiers in France, and not all of them possessed morals. When prostitution was unavailable or perhaps unwanted, hundreds of soldiers showed that they were not above violating others to pursue their desires. Rapes and assaults on the women of France occurred across the country. Signs of the abuses committed by the liberators started in 1944, when the Allied armies were contained to the areas around Normandy. Scores of women accused American soldiers of rape, but were largely ignored by the military leadership in the area. As the soldiers advanced into France, they took their lust and willingness to abuse with them. A morbid joke began to spread among the French population. Our men had to disguise themselves under the Germans. but when the Americans came, we had to hide the women. After the war ended, the soldiers went from constantly moving to stationary deployments. The waves of rape that had occurred in the soldiers' wake now became a curtain, descending upon the French public like a heavy fog. The number of rapes that occurred is unknown. 904 men were officially tried for rape by military courts in Europe, but these were just the men who were caught red-handed, or who were prosecuted by officers who decided to actually act on accusations. This number also refers to all of the fronts of Europe, making it even more implausibly low than it already seemed. The true number of women who were assaulted by American soldiers is undoubtedly much higher. The historian J. Robert Lilly estimates that the true number of rapes committed by American servicemen in France sits around 3,500 and 14,000 throughout the Western Front. With the unstable status of the re-emerging French government and the overwhelming presence of the American military, the victims of these rapes had to seek justice via the US military court. It would be unfair to say that the US military fully ignored the accusations leveled against its soldiers, but it certainly did not pursue the issue with extreme prejudice either. For example, roughly 1 million men were stationed in France immediately after the war, and only 180 of them were tried for rape in France. To put this into perspective, assuming that Lilly's estimate of 3,000 rapes is correct, each man tried for rape in France by the US military would have had to have assaulted roughly 17 women. This isn't impossible, but it's highly unlikely. So the reality is that most of the men who raped French women during and after World War II were never caught or tried. Credit where credit is due. General Eisenhower issued orders to his commanders to take action against all allegations of crimes committed by American soldiers. However, the actions taken and the levels of enforcement leveled against the criminals were left to the local commanders, with differing results. Sadly, the lack of overall convictions is not the only way the US military failed to properly handle the problem of rape and assault by US soldiers. Another injustice occurred in the trials themselves. The soldiers in France who were accused and tried of rape embodied the racist attitudes of American society at the time. 72% of the men tried by the military for rape were African American. Furthermore, nearly all of the men executed by the military for rape were black, 25 out of 29. This was in part due to accusation numbers, as African American soldiers were accused of rape by the French public at a higher percentage than their white counterparts. However, it was mainly due to the fact that the majority of the US military still believed in a color line between white and black soldiers. The American armed forces were still segregated in the 1940s, with African American soldiers often being relegated to support roles away from the front lines. Disproportionately prosecuting black soldiers for rape killed two birds with one stone. It reaffirmed the racist beliefs of the American public, and it avoided punishing decorated battle veterans for an obscene crime. The eventual withdrawal of American forces from France saw a decrease in the number of crimes committed. However, the rate of crimes per soldier went up as the overall number of men stationed in France went down, showing that the soldiers who were left were no more afraid to abuse the public than they had been immediately after the war ended. Objectively, the crimes committed by American soldiers in France pale in comparison to the atrocities committed by the Waffen-SS. The widespread carnage created by both the German and Russian armies on the Eastern Front, or the unbelievable amount of death and destruction unleashed by the Japanese armies in China. However, a lesser number of crimes does not mean that the victims of American soldiers in France suffered any less. Though property crime is harder to establish, one thing that does seem clear is that a very small number of soldiers committed rape in France, at least in comparison to the number of men that were stationed there. That being said, thousands of lives were still torn apart by American GIs, and thousands of women who believed they had been rescued from occupation found themselves abused by their self-proclaimed liberators. The legacy of the American armies in Europe during the Second World War has long been one of swagger, heroism, and selfless service against a great evil. This can still be the legacy, but with one calibration. War is still war. Much like they were not blameless of war crimes or combat-related atrocities, American soldiers in France were not chaste warriors honorably serving a higher cause. Two things can be true at once, and some of the same men who heroically risked their lives to liberate France became a nightmare to the same people they had fought to free.